These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Land, Food, and Freedom with Georie Bryant. Africa World Now Project is next. The collectively generative nature inherent in the interdependent relationship between technology, the communal means of production and distribution, and innovative physical and creative intellectual work is distracted and co-opted by the need to extract the value of this relationship as structured from the capitalist logic of labor. The sole purpose of this is to maintain an aggressive and exclusionary accumulation of capital in the hands of a few. The creative and inquisitive nature of human social and cultural capacities feed the extractive forces of capitalism. The necessity to disembody knowledge production and sever the symbiotic relationship between all sentient beings from nature and the universe is a muti-complex process of maintaining the supremacist ethic that organizes current political and economic relations. This fact, in its most theoretical and practical form, permeates the very cultural fabric of the dominant expression of global disorder. In short, capitalism is the form that functions to create life itself. Therefore, work is redefined as labor in order to extract its value in all forms, not for communal benefit, but the aggressive and exclusionary aggregation of capital through intentionally violent processes. In 1867, in Capital, Volume 1, the question is posited: what is at the bottom of the original accumulation of capital, i.e., the historical genesis of capital, insofar as it is not immediate transformation of slaves and serfs into wage labor, i.e., a mere change of form? Private property, as the antithesis of social collective property, exists only where the means of labor and the external conditions of labor belong to private individuals. And private property has a different character according to whether these private individuals are laborers or not laborers. The private property of the laborer and means of production is the foundation of petty industry, whether agriculture, manufacturing, or both. Petty industry, again, is an essential condition for the development of social production and of the free individuality of the laborer themselves. It is true, the petty mode of production exists also under slavery, serfdom, and other states of dependence. But it flourishes, it lets loose its whole energy, it attains its adequate classical form only where the laborer is the private owner of their own means of labor set in action by themselves, the peasant of the land which he cultivates, the artisan of the tool which he handles as a virtuoso. This mode of production presupposes parceling of the soil and scattering of the other means of production. Its annihilation, the transformation of the individualized and scattered means of production into socially concentrated ones, of tiny property of the many into huge property of the few, the expropriation of the great masses of people from the soil, from the means of subsistence, and from the means of labor, this terrifying and painfully violent expropriation of the masses of the people forms the prelude to the history of capital. As soon as this process of transformation has sufficiently decomposed the old society from top to bottom, as soon as the laborers are turned into proletarians, their means of labor into capital, as soon as the capitalist mode of production stands on its own feet, then the further socialization of labor and the further transformation of the land and other means of production into socially exploited and therefore common means of production takes a new form. That which is now to be expropriated is no longer the labor working for themselves, but the capitalists exploiting many laborers. This expropriation is accomplished by the action of the intrinsic laws of capitalist production, by the centralization of capital. One capitalist will then kill many. They will also turn on each other. Along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class. In short, the very demise of capitalism is built into its ethic, its ethos, its logic. Nowhere is this process of continued alienation in all forms, hyper-extraction, and systemic exploitation observed than when we examine its persistent imposition on the Africana world. It is also here that a study of the relational practices of African indigenous knowledge to land as a vehicle to freedom thus provides a clear view of how organized collectives can accelerate and exacerbate capitalism's demise. It is evident when exploring Black radical and revolutionary resistance across time and space. C.L.R. James's argument that power relations are laid bare during times of revolution if the observer sees them always as projections of the subsoil from which they come. Revolutions, even those that do not quite rise to the level of conscious practice, can reveal the demands and capacities of those who are usually silenced. The words of those in power are typically committed to historical record. But in times of revolution, whether one is consciously aware of the war that is happening in every sphere of human existence or not, the voices and accounts of the exploited and those opposed to dispossession are also heard. For James, the Africans who rose up against what was the most advanced capitalist production system in the world, French colonial Haiti, was and still is an important study of revolutionary practice, even if the objectives were not fully realized through co-optation, betrayal, etc. The European merchants and planters had constructed a Caribbean sugar industry that involved slave ships, auctions and markets, plantations, huge barracks, sugar mills, and the newest factory technology. All of these components were seamlessly integrated into emerging global commodity markets via well-established transportation, financial, and communication systems. Yet, to this formation, Africans fearlessly and bravely rose against this advanced capitalist mode of production. Lee Brownhill in Land, Food, Freedom Struggles for the Gendered Commons in Kenya, 1870 to 2007, adds even more clarity to the extension of the aforementioned line of reasoning, specifically the deep tradition of radical and revolutionary Africana thought and practice as a response and reaction to capitalist logics. Brownhill argues that in Kenya, there has been an almost unbroken century-long chain of social movements against capitalist enclosures. Kenyans have persistently defended and elaborated their life-centered subsistence political economies. Subsistence social relations make up the subsoil out of which revolutionary movements have risen. Moreover, it is peasant women in rural and urban areas that are the frontline food farmers, preparers, and traders whose daily work sustains people in the subsistence realm and cash economy. The work feeding people brings many women farmers and traders into direct confrontation with the commodifying regime of capital. What are the material and intellectual contradictions that indigenous African and African diasporan communities must contend with in order to reconcile the social realities produced by capitalist logic today? At present, the dominant discourses of this reconciliation are centered around inherently detrimental practices, i.e., capitalism with a black face, the reproduction of the logic of private property as foundational to capital accumulation. Where do we return to find a path towards freedom? Where do we find a platform or practice to reintegrate with our collective selves? It can be argued, and in the conversation with Georie Bryant you will hear next, found figuratively and literally with our hands in the soil, a reconnection with the earth itself, in a material and non-material synthesis of struggle, study, and build. The conversation you will hear next is a delinking of capitalist logic of land as private property, food as African indigenous knowledge practices, and cooperatives outside of capitalist interpretations. In short, we explore African indigenous relationships with land and food as inherent throughout the African world as a means to freedom. Georie Bryant is a community organizer, chef, and agriculturalist native to Durham, North Carolina. Working through both his organization Symbiotic and in collaboration with other organizations in the region, Georie seeks to address issues of historical and contemporary oppression, particularly those centered around food insecurity, cultural erasure, and appropriation. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Thank you for taking the time to join us today to have a off-the-cuff conversation, as Brother Malcolm said, or El Haj Malik El Shabazz had said in one of his speeches, opening speech. We're going to have an off-the-cuff conversation about some of the ideas and some of the practices and different types of organizational articulations or expressions that you've been engaged in that is centered around some very important work that includes or centers food production, the role of food, the role of growing, farming, land, all of those things in the context of how do we build sustainable movements, but also the historical processes that are centered around land, centered around the importance or lack thereof of centering, food. Thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me here, bro.
We've been engaged in thinking about a number of things over the past few years, having an opportunity to, be connected by a mutual acquaintance. And it's funny because you were dealing with some international work is really how you got connected with me about a few years ago. But when we're talking about work, we're talking about ultimately, we're going to talk about like what you actually do and what you're a part of. Could you talk a little bit of how you came to do the work that you are doing now, and also talk about the importance of the work that you're doing now?
So it's a long process, a long story. It's ancestral. My grandparents were activists in a community called East End in Durham, North Carolina. And my grandfather worked with Ann Atwater, and he was the head of the East End Council, and he was also on several boards with her in her anti-poverty work. And Atwater was a big activist in Durham, and there's been movies about Ann Atwater and some of that work, and so that component of it. A lesser known fact is that my grandmother actually married Green. So my grandfather's name was Luther McDuffie Holman. My grandmother was Mary Green Holman when she got married. She was she had a garden in her community, and actually the way that they met is that my grandfather was working at the Washington Duke Hotel, and he would steal food and come home and bring it home to the community and feed the folks in the community, and that's how he met her. And later on, she and her family, they would garden for their own food, and it's like very this community is it's like less than a mile away from downtown Durham. But they back in that time, people often had chickens and other things even in the city limits, and so they would garden, and she fed the community from that garden, and so that's kind of like just those stories, the stories I came up with in that same community. I was doing some organizing of my own as a part of an organization I was with, and that's where I learned to cook. And we used to feed people in that same community in the East End. And eventually, I would go to culinary school. I would learn how to farm, But it would bring me back to that kind of community lens that my grandparents had in doing that work, and also the way I was introduced to it too. Like we would engage. We were doing this work at the height of redlining, so the conditions of the community, the concentration of poverty was really really high, and I lived in that community and I worked in that community. And so out of culinary school, getting into farming, oftentimes you're in rural spaces, and I was working in fine dining, and both of these things were like access barriers to the community I came from. And I always thought about, like, well, how do I get this work back to those original points? And eventually I got engaged in the food justice work. Um, but I also saw the contradictions in the way that food justice work was very, very, very um, crippled in some ways, but also kind of fortified in a nonprofit industrial complex. And so that contradiction was very always prevalent. And it kind of pushed me further to try to figure out, like, how do we deal with the things that are causing these lack of access? What the term coined by Karen Washington, food apartheid, that's happening in our community. So
Yeah, so just to kind of piggyback a pull on this thread of the practice that you have developed that comes from your ancestral or familial roots. You
mhm.
mentioned, your grandfather freeing food from spaces and bringing it back to the community, right? So I think that that follows a long tradition.
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit more about the organizing, particularly that your family was involved in relation to the communities that you all are a part of? And you talk about having ancestral roots, and you kind of studied that as well. Could you link that
Yeah.
a little bit?
Yeah. My apologies. At a much later time, well, actually, it's not later. So in 1994, in my the beginning of my fifth grade year, at the school that housing this community is called East End School, and this school is kind of nationally known because it's in a movie called The Best of Enemies, and it's a school that gets set on fire by the Klan that and that water kind of organizes around. Well, I was the last graduating class of that school. We took go on a field trip to a place called Statville Plantation, and I go to while on this tour, they go to this house, and they show us these fingerprints in the bricks that's still there, and they tell us all this story. And at the end of that, they say this is the Holman house. Now, the Holman house at Stagville is about less than a mile away from where my great grandparents are buried, my grandfather's father and his mother, and it's less than, I don't know, 6 miles away from where our family reunion used to be held at, and where our my family land that my great grandfather purchased is at. So um, that all is kind of interwoven into the story about this community, is because I wouldn't have gotten to that space if it wasn't for the school and this community. But that's kind of the beginning stages of me understanding, like, oh, we come from a place, although we're here in the center of Durham, we actually go back further out to a more rural space. And this place is kind of one of those origin points, not the origin point, but one of those points that we can follow our line through. And so having that at 10 years old, and then later on getting more engaged in the work around that particular space. I actually went on a tour, and my mother was there, and I shared with my mother that this is the Holman house, and she, my grandfather's daughter, and she was able to actually give the site coordinator all of our family history, and then we were able to track ourselves back. And that was the beginning stages of me being able to start a trajectory of learning about where my ancestors actually came from. So I found out they came from the Virginia ports, and from there I was able to track them back to Igbo land in southern Nigeria. And so that's kind of how that trajectory happened. When you go into culinary school, when you're learning culinary education or culinary arts, essentially you're learning a food anthropology, right? And I was always, even in that space, thinking about the food of my ancestors, but having pairing that information with this geographical understanding really made me think about the materials, the actual the plants, the animals that my ancestors would have had in contact with while they were in Africa, and then the ones that they would have been in contact when they were brought here. And that really informs a lot of my work. As you get into that particular knowledge base around food and culture, it leads you into so many other components. And that's for a particular reason that we'll probably discuss in a few minutes.
Yeah, I actually was going to go there. I was actually going
Okay.
to. I was actually, just trying to give our listeners, some
Yeah.
type of through line
Yeah.
through which we can go off on those avenues. But when you're talking about, you mentioned, you talk about these origin points,
Hmm.
are points of origin that do not negate other points of continuity, but it's important, kind of like to try to identify tradition or genealogy
Hmm. Yeah.
and you talk about food justice,
Hmm.
which is a very interesting conceptualization of justice
Hmm.
in the context of you going to culinary school and, as you say, learning anthropology, but then you're interested in the food of your ancestors, but also the way that food is cultivated for particular purposes.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about how that experience of going to the plantation, connecting it to a longer genealogy, connecting it to a longer tradition of organizing and activism.
Yeah.
How did that culminate to the point that you were like, you know what, this is the space, this is the space that I'm trying to expand, food and land and this relationship to our ancestral genealogies that
Mhm.
we all try to develop a path towards freedom. Talk a little bit about that. Let's go there. Let's talk
Yeah.
about those the lack of in food justice, but
Mhm.
also what you're bringing to the conversations.
Right. So there's many avenues to go down, and I'm gonna try to tie these together. So I think one thing that was very interesting to me coming up, I was blessed to live with my grandparents at one point in time, and scarcity. My mom used to say this actually to me all the time. She said, "We were poor, but we didn't know we were poor." Right? And she was saying we had everything we needed. My mom would sew our clothes. She would make clothes for us. We grew our own food. We were self-sustaining. For me to be in the same neighborhood as my mother grew up and her mother grew up, and to hear those stories and see the like almost very different experience that the people who I was going to school with were having was almost like in some ways we're experiencing this today too in the same neighborhood, but it's almost like different, the same geographical space, but it's almost like different dimensions in some ways, right? Even now, like, because I experienced a lot of violence in that same neighborhood, and I literally, because of gentrification, the neighborhood is almost completely transformed into something else. I've seen people out on their laptops and jogging in places where I've seen people shot, right? And it's, you go through this very, like, almost, it literally feels like you're in a Twilight Zone episode or something where it's like, yo, like look at how many times you can map different experiences on the same geographical space. And also struggling when I was a young person, not living in my mother's house, but still living in the neighborhood with, I gotta drive so far to go get some food. I gotta leave my community. And at one point in time, I didn't have a car, so I had to walk a mile or two or three or four or five sometimes to get something to eat. Like that's what we mean by food apartheid, right? Where my grandmother had food in her backyard, and my mother had food in her backyard. Now I'm having to get in a car and find a grocery store, and so that's a different experience. Um, and that's economic, right? That's an economic component. And when we talk about it, once I started studying, well, I'm gonna go to another point actually. Um, when I started farming, I was resistant to it. There was a Jamaican brother who worked at the culinary school that I was at, formerly incarcerated, a well-known farmer in this area now. And The brother really embodied so many components him being someone who was justice involved, someone who also came from that same type of background as I did, but also was in this new way of expressing himself. But because he grew up in Jamaica, was also a part of his culture. I had to wrestle with some different ideologies within myself, some different blood memory. Why was I resistant to growing food? And I think there was a connotation of that being, as Elaine Locke would say, that's beneath us, that's something behind us, right? Like we're getting away from that. And that being something handed over to me that came from a generation before, but was not in my grandmother, right? My grandmother gardened up until she got put in a rest home. Like, well, that was a part of her culture. And so once we get to this point of actually visiting the plantation as an adult and dealing with all of the emotions that come up with that, and realizing that, also understanding that I'm hearing more stories about my great grandfather who was a tobacco farmer and he grew food for himself. He also grew tobacco, but he also would go out in the woods and collect herbs and make his own medicine. And then at some point would go, we actually have a family law that he would catch the train in the town and go sell some of that herbal medicine downtown. And so like those type of things are starting to give you a whole experience that by the time that I track myself back to West Africa, I'm looking at the material world differently because I'm working some of these handed down ideas, thoughts, philosophies by people who want me to have alienation from the food that I eat. I'm working through some of these connotations around the experiences I had while working in the food industry, where people could feel like they could yell at you, right, because you didn't get their order right. And it's like, well, do you go yell at bankers if they, do like, why do we think we can do this to people that work in this industry? And what is that rooted in? I had to work through a lot of those components, and it took me to a place that when I started studying Igbo culture specifically, and I started learning about the way that they organize themselves. By the time I get to that point, I'm having a different relationship and my eyes are open to now I'm understanding like, okay, there's this system called the Afia system. And the Afia system, something that I'm working on right now is I took a class called Economics for Emancipation. I'm actually going to be with this brother later this week, Francisco Perez, and he talks about all the different forms of economy. And when I'm studying these West African agricultural systems, they actually map on these different forms of economy. And so the Afia system is very akin to market socialism. It's not market socialism, but it's very akin to it. And the yam and the production of the yam is what's centered in this system of Afia. And so there's many stories about how that system came to be. Many of them are spiritual and have their colloquiums, and many of them are folklorish. But it kind of, once you see that and you start looking at the other systems, you see these societies structure themselves politically based off the growing of this starch because we are carbohydrate machines. We live off of carbohydrates. And so the Jola people of Senegal are rice producers, and they organize themselves differently based off the labor and the production of that rice. And so, like, once I started, this opened this world up, going from this kid that just knew where his ancestors was from to now seeing the way that even in Durham, what we understand as Black Wall Street, and I'm not by any means celebrating that, is built off of the tobacco growers that were formerly enslaved people and the way that those individuals were able to build wealth in that region, develop what we would consider to be Black Wall Street when those came in to benefit off the selling and the production of that tobacco. You got that hierarchical class structure built. What we're working on now is unweaving that and telling the story of the communalism that underlines that in those relationships. But that's kind of the stories that I grew up with. And so it helped me to when I'm looking into Igbo culture to understand, okay, this Afia system is not Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street is not Afia. They're two completely different things. The Jola rice system does tend to produce different things. So, for instance, Winston-Salem, I love telling this story. So, Winston-Salem and Durham have very similar, we could call them political economies as far as cities are concerned. Tobacco, large African populations due to mass plantations. But because the people are different people, they organize themselves differently. And so in Durham, we don't you have these individuals organizing themselves to create a Black Wall Street, but in Winston-Salem, you have the first Black tobacco production union in the United States. Now, there's some other factors that played in that role for people to come visit that space by all means, but the way that those individuals organize themselves around those particular topics is different and gets you that type of collective action because the majority of them come from rice producing people, where the majority of us in Durham come from yam producing people. That's just a factor. It's not the factor. It's not the total factor. It's just a component to looking at these economic communities as they're bringing those things into this community with them. Now, that doesn't mean that the yam producing people are not communal or not collective or not those things. But the way that they interact with capitalism produces something different in one city, and then in less than an hour away, it produces something else. And it's a very interesting component case study to show how these things map onto each other.
Yeah, so the cultural elements that inform, people based upon their ancestral and historical memories. Because I'm also hearing, clearly the work that you do, particularly with, around the cultivation of food and land, there's a material and non-materiality here, right? And so making sure that we understand the impact of capitalism that arrest the exploration of the cultivation, understanding the cultivation of land and the production of food, having in an African context a more advanced meaning than it does in a capitalist society becomes important. Am I kind of going?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I think, you know, one of the interesting things, the components to that is when you're dealing with structures that are much older than capitalism in itself, right? Because capitalism needs mercantilism first in order for it to actually take hold. And that's not to say that trade didn't exist, but trade based off a geographical boundary isn't necessarily implemented in those constructs in West Africa until you get other actors moving and migrating and on top of already existing communities, right? And so like those that's when geographical bounds become extremely important. In certain communities where people are nomadic, they interact differently with that type of geographical nature until in certain instances where they're told to stick to stop moving. Like you got to be here now. And the Fulani is a great example of that, right? Like the Fulani at one point in time are primary traders. Them and many other herdsman tribes are primary trading with these yam producers and with some of these rice producers and plantain producers in other communities. But until the Berlin Conference sets up these geographical bounds and say, well, this is where you guys got to stay now. Now you start to get conflicts with these tribes where people were once nomadic. They're now kind of static in some ways. And so those things are not based solely off of production and means of production solely in the same way that labor, and this is the most important part for me, and this is what my food journey has taught me, is that labor and our relationship to labor is working off of some particular premises, right? That in those communities, labor is a community act, and in our community, labor is something to be despised. So extraction is not always, but extraction is sometimes deemed necessary. And that that particular framework is something that I'm been trying to figure out. How do I communicate that with my community? Because as long as we see labor, and I would some people say like a labor of love to be kind of punny, right? As long as we see labor as something that to be despised and to be in some ways, disregarded, or we need to move away from it, we're going to continue to struggle with this notion that that labor needs to be extracted from someone else. Like I need to benefit from someone else's labor in that moment. And that's one of the things of us thinking about communalism, and particularly as one of those early, like very small windows, as many things that happen in Black culture, where you get a reprieve, or a window of time where we're not necessarily thinking about how we can make money off of this thing that we're creating, until it, very quickly gets exploited by capitalism. Not too long after that.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, because there's so many ways you could dive into this, but one of the ways that what you're talking about, of course, is this commodification and
Mm-hmm.
the relationship between the extractive processes that capitalist logic does with labor, what
Mm-hmm.
labor means. So there's a hierarchy, right? There's a categorization
Mm-hmm.
of labor that goes against traditional, ancestral, and historical understandings
Yeah.
of labor or work. So
Mm-hmm.
work and labor becomes,
Mm-hmm.
two different
Yeah.
conceptualizations. So work in the context of an African indigenous knowledge system, working for the benefit of the collective. So your individual work is a part of a communal processes of social, well, family, social, and then of course that aggregates up, that expands up. So what you're talking about here is a very important in the context of even farming, right? In the context of
Mm-hmm.
food work, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the context of students who make decisions based upon how labor is valued in an ancestral and historical context in African communities, as opposed to redefined and captured in a capitalist understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an important intervention into, because what you're talking about is the value of the work
Mm-hmm.
and the extractive processes of labor as defined in a capitalist system,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that obviously that term, that's a hurdle I think
Yeah.
that most people have to engage with.
Man, so another component into this is something that was unlocked for me when I actually heard those stories about my great grandfather and this herbal medicine. Because many of those herbs cannot be put into production, right? Many of them are, some people call them volunteers. Some people, the earth naturally produces these herbs on their own. And they need a set of conditions in order for them to reproduce themselves. Many of them cannot grow on land that has been tilled. Many of them need to be with a partner, sometimes an animal that needs you to not till the land in order for that thing. So there's when you take out, in this context, when you take the buffalo out, right? Now you've taken out certain plants that the buffalo eats, and excretes the seed, and it now germinates through that gut of that buffalo. Or birds that are now extinct. We lose the plant because, so you that changes the relationship. So when we're ancestrally, we're looking at the whole of the environment and all of the relationships involved. And production is only saying, I can only, if I can't reproduce this at mass scale, my homie Justin Robinson says, if you can't enslave the plant, then it doesn't have a value to you, right? And so, from a more indigenous or Afro-indigenous perspective, or African people who are brought to this place, I'll say it that way. I don't want to get it confused. And they're, as Sylvia Winter would say, them being indigenized as they come here, right? They're looking at the environment differently. They're seeing the relationships between nature, plant, animal, even human is a part of that relationship, right? And not necessarily about solely being able to mass produce to create plantations to create these large swaths of row crops, and that's actually we're looking at about 60 years left of topsoil due to that type of production, and we got to figure something out about that. Right. So that relationship and the way that extraction is looking, not just at labor, but also the environment, right, is regarding certain things as viable options for production, and that production being the dictator in which we as a society relate to it. So I practice herbal medicine, right? And there's certain things that I can go out and I can harvest in my yard or in the woods or whatever. And those things are actually very beneficial for, like sweet gum has Tamiflu in it, as just an example. Well, most people ain't out here growing sweet gum farms, you know, or black walnut as a antifungal. Um, producing it produces a very antifungal. A lot of people make black walnut salve from that. I mean, you could have a black walnut farm if you wanted to, but it's very difficult and it's hard to relate to that in the same way. And that's why we don't see those things, is because capitalism has deemed those not viable options for production. But that doesn't mean that my relationship with that thing needs to be solely based off of capitalism's relationship. And that same thing goes for our food.
So even when we think about gentrification, because you mentioned gentrification, so even when we think about gentrification, it disrupts life at every particular level, right? So then when you mention, and we know we're living in a period of global climate change rapidly, so there are foods that are basically extinct. You know, we know this with the overproduction of land that capitalism has done. This notion that you got to conquer land, you got to conquer the elements, that has impacted at a micro level, literally at a biological level of human existence, right? Which was disrupted in the context of the enslavement period, the chattel enslavement period, but also, of course, we know that the West African a period of chattel slavery is an iteration or a fraction of slavery. So what you're doing really is kind of mapping, you know, Africa, or trying to do Pan-African work with the ideas, particularly that are ancient. How does Africa, because you mentioned you know, tracing your ancestry, how does that really fit in the work that you're doing? I mean, I know that you do seed trading, you go into trying to figure out how to, you know, regrow or reintroduce foods and certain diets. You know, you got some, you know, folk and conspiracy theorists that, you know, talk about, you know, diseases and the relationship, you know, all of that. You know, just jump in anywhere, jump in that pool.
Yeah,
I just
man. No,
carved
I
for
think
us.
that, you know, so I think for me, because of the dire situation that we're in, climate and with people, it's extremely important for us to think about alternatives to the current system that we're in. I think for us, you know, I'm a believer in you know, I'm getting in trouble probably for this, but it's okay. So I believe in the black belt, and the black belt thesis, and that component of nationalism. But I also believe in land back, right? That's a whole two conversations need to be held very, very closely, and with a lot of nuance and a lot of things. And we could have a whole nother conversation on that, because I have relationships with indigenous communities, as well as someone who's descended from certain indigenous communities here in North Carolina. And I think it's really important to think about that. I think all of us, regardless, we all gonna have to deal with the issues of climate change. We're all going to have to deal with the fallout of capitalism. Everybody, there's like we're not going to escape that. So for me, is the contradictions of the day-to-day system that we all live in, the environmental conditions that are like, it's getting warmer, the sea is rising. There's islands in the Caribbean that will probably be overtaken, maybe in my lifetime. I hope not. I mean, we saw Katrina. We saw, you know, we're seeing this thing happening, And it's not solely just about the environment, because to me, one of my primary goals in life is for us, especially as Black people, to understand that we are just as much a part of the environment as anything else. Like, the one of the things that they took from us is our ecological cells. In that thing that you just spoke about, with utilizing our bodies to terramorph this place, right? And to create this break in the relationship for many of us via many different forms of colonization. But I want to be clear from my perspective, and some people don't agree with me on the definition, but Black people have been colonized by this experience of enslavement. So how do I get back to who I am? How do I decolonize myself? I have to understand where I come from. Now, I might not be able to return to that identity solely, but the new identity that I have has to be informed by the identity and the things that I come from. Pre-colonial, not just what, and I can understand the conditions of West Africa, and I've been there. I've seen what's happening. I know what's going on in Abuja right now. I see it, you know what I mean? But I have to be informed by the scholarship, right? And these are, and my teacher is a practices the culture, but also has a PhD and wrote on technology and Igbo culture, right? And the way that, and his dissertation was on that, like the scholarship, right, of John Ume, who taught at, I think it was at Oxford or Cambridge, I forget. But there's many different, in all of these communities, you have intellectuals who are looking at their culture, and they're writing about it in a way, in an anti-colonial way, to compare it to what's happening to them in their own colonialism. And so I return to those things to inform how do I think about what we're going to be on the other side of this conflict and this crisis that we're in environmentally. Hopefully that answered your question.
No, no, it actually opened up more, more avenues because we can go, we can go any route because I mean, obviously what we're talking about, and this is all centered underneath the practice that you have developed, that has been handed down, and the genealogy that has been handed down, particularly your vocation, that you're developing a decolonial practice of farming, a decolonial practice of understanding our relationship to the natural world, and also the crisis that we're living in becomes very important. So no, opens up, which also moves into a question because in addition to obviously your ancestral and familial intellectual traditions, what are some other, what are some additional? You mentioned briefly, you mentioned Sylvia Winter earlier. What are some other kind of as you're studying, as you're moving into this space? Because again, we're going to get to my next thing as we're kind of thinking about this is your work is inherently international.
Right.
You've been engaged with Afro descendant communities in Colombia.
Yeah.
You travel, consistently, back and forth to the continent, back and forth to Afro Spanish speaking African communities that you have, been engaged in. But
Yeah.
before we get there, what are some of the intellectual um, strands of thoughts that kind of informed how you're actually approaching this processes of a decolonial practice that you're attempting to go into, which is a very, very white space, particularly when you
Yeah.
talk about the nonprofit
Yeah.
industry. Our big agriculture is like all over top of this. They do everything to undermine,
Yeah.
like-minded folks such as yourself. What are some of those intellectual gods that
Yeah.
that you kind of use on a day-to-day basis that you kind of find yourself going back to, right? Kind
Mm-hmm.
of kind of reinscribing and
Yeah.
rethinking as you're developing your practice.
Man, I've been lucky to come in contact with so many genius folks in my life, that have introduced me to people. So uh yeah, Cabral, I think, is like one of the most pivotal, um, the most pivotal folks in this work, because we're talking about culture as a weapon, right? We're talking about this using culture as a tool in an anti-colonial way. But I think the first thing I was introduced to here, and I've been deeply informed by Mary Baraka, um, um, and yeah, I would be out on the farm just listening to so many books. Walter Rodney for sure. Um, but pedagogy of the oppressed is something that really, really impacted me. A thing that I learned while I was in Columbia was about participatory action research by I want to say is Orlando Fowles-Bowe, I think is the author's name of that particular type. But it's to think about like how do we engage community on Fowles-Bowe, excuse me. But then there's like Claudia Jones. Claudia Jones is one of the primary writers of the Black Belt thesis. There's so many people that folks have brought to me. Robin D.G. Kelly, and Hammer and Hoe is very pivotal book to thinking about agriculture and how we organize around it as Black folks. Yeah, I can name more folks. But the communities themselves become also that. So like the Palenqueros in Colombia and the Cimarrones, and sometimes they call themselves Quilombos of Colombia, very pivotal in number one, the way that they understand the laws of their community and their nation and can articulate those laws, but largely because the revolutionaries that worked in that community made sure that they included that community in the forming of the new laws that govern them. So they have the 91 Constitution, they have the 94 Amendment that gives land to Afro-descendant people, or says that Afro-descendant people can be able to hold land collectively. That's very informative, in my experience. And then being able to visit Matanzas in Cuba and to visit the Casa de Africa and many other places that they have in Cuba, very informative, and to see some of the work. There was a recent project that I saw Conrad did, do a cartography of Matanzas. And like these things have been in many ways eye-opening, and then also caused me to go and see what happened in my community, what's happened here. And so that's where we start seeing like Hammer and Hoe, and like, oh wow, like this isn't just alien to the global South. Like there was people in the past who've attempted this work here, but because of organizing by the fascist right, in many ways, is caused the squashing of those efforts. But we have to pick that work back up. We have to pick that work back up. So that's what keeps me kind of informed. Louisa, I hope that every African person in the United States gets to go see these spaces, not as a tourist, but as a comrade in the community. So you can understand what maroonage actually is, and society building. And so we don't just use that term as a pop culture concept of like marooning, right? I'm currently trying to actually investigate the maroons of northeastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia in the Dismal Swamp, right? And to understand that more clearly of like, what happened to that community. What did they go and work in the longshoremen in Norfolk, or like where did they end up at in those ways? So those are things that we're talking about, and also the Gullah Geechee community here has been a new teacher for me. I've been learning so much more about the way that that community has organized itself, and in ways that we can join in, because I think if I'm not mistaken, there was a huge portion of the Black Belt was considered that zone. Um, and we don't think about, the role that plays, like in Colombia. It maps onto Colombia's El Choco very similarly, and how that community and many, up until the Columbia Free Trade Agreement was a primarily black space. That unfortunately, that Columbia Free Trade Agreement displaced more Africans, probably the largest displacement of Africans in the Western Hemisphere. That's somewhat speculation, but I would love to see the numbers on anything else remotely close to it. And unfortunately, there was Barack Obama's administration that did that. But that was it maps very closely to our Gullah Geechee region. And so yeah, we're trying to actually, I don't know if I could talk about this here, but we're trying to bring a sister from the Cimarron community in Colombia to the Gullah Geechee region this year for we to have this conversation together. And so yeah, that my work is informed greatly by that because my ancestors I met people in Palenque were like, we are Igbo, just like you were Igbo, right? They got off a boat at a different location than my ancestors got off a boat. So I can't just see myself solely in the US centric perspective on what Black is, because I could be easily a Spanish speaker or a Portuguese speaker or someone else because a decision someone else made about my community or about my ancestors. So for me, yeah, I mean, I think, I hope that, and food tells that story. And I think for me, that's one of those things of like, when you're in Palenque, they have the rice that comes from the grain coast, and they also have the yam, right? And you kind of get to see how are these things operating in this part of the world, rather than in West Africa. And the same thing in Bahia in Brazil, the same thing in the Caribbean region. I mean, Jamaica. The reason why those communities of Maroons, the many different communities of Maroons, a botanist messed up and brought West African plants to Jamaica. And when he did that, he set up a trajectory for people to sustain themselves outside of the construct of a plantation. And that allows for more maroonage due to having the material of home of West Africa. And so that's why you can get hibiscus there. That's why you can get yam there and cocoa. There's so many things. Somebody brought that, and some of it was brought by Africans. I'm not giving all that credit to that person, but it is documented that this person decided to bring hibiscus and other things. But the seeds of okra and certain other and the rice seeds, those things were brought in the hair of many African women, people we would identify as women today. But yeah, those will be assigned as women. Let me say that. But that plays a major role in how people organize themselves, the ability to create a similar space in those geographical regions. And hopefully, us looking at that. And I hate to say it like this, but unfortunately, climate change is providing us opportunity to grow some of those West African things here because it's getting warmer in certain regions. Now we can't grow certain things need more daylight and things like that, but certain things that need temperature, they need ground temperatures at certain high numbers. The ground is getting warmer, so we can think about that as well.
So you mentioned maroon communities, Palenques, and and you mentioned and we have to be clear, these are structures, organizing systems where you had multiple African ways of being and multiple forms of knowledge that aggregated themselves as a resistance to the plantocracy, to the plantation economy. So even this notion of the plantation economy or the plantation itself has just morphed itself, right? You could think about plantations, and then it's also social production forces that pops up alongside of it through education, through healthcare, and so forth and so on. Talk about your search as you are learning, particularly understanding, studying the historical in relation to communities that you work with in North Carolina and Durham, Winston-Salem. what are the structures in relate that you have found, or the systems that you have found? Because you're learning these systems, you're going to Afro-descendant communities in Colombia, you're going to Brazil, you're going to Cuba. What is the importance, I should say, of developing systems and structures or organizing
Mm,
ourselves uh, around a different ideological and also cultural grounding in this particular period of time where you have fascism that is closing, creating enclosures. You have global climate change that's creating inhospitable environments. How should we be thinking about this? What are some of the lessons that you can see or that you may have run into? Uh, um,
man.
Particularly the structures, the institutions, because again, you're trying to understand, again, your work is Pan-African
Mm-hmm.
essentially,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Material and non-material, the idea of a connectedness through culture, through ideas, but then the actual literal way
Yeah.
we grow our food, the way that we organize our spaces,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what are some structures? I mean, you're involved in and also creating
Mm-hmm.
different, systems and institutions, which are also probably related to the ultimate objectives of your work. Talk
Yeah.
about those systems and structures and the organizing structures that you have seen, the
Yeah.
potentialities of those.
Yeah. So I spoke about AFIA and those things, and those are like more historical structures. I think we live. So when I speak of these structures, I'm gonna have to use terminology that, unfortunately, because we live in capitalism, some of this terminology doesn't mean the same thing here in the United States as it means in the global South. So when we say cooperative, right, I don't mean a consumer-owned cooperative where people who have the means of purchasing have more say in that cooperative, which actually is no different than any other uh, 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 company in the United States based off of shareholders or things. But I don't. What I don't mean is like no consumer-owned cooperative, right? Um, and so there's cooperative structures that exist in most of all of these communities. But I think what's interesting though is that it's not solely production and production related organizing. There's councils that are set up on every level in these communities that women's councils, elders councils, men councils, guards that are not police, right? They don't carry guns. They don't police their people. They own people with guns. They're just guards. Actually, I'm also thinking about outsiders coming in trying to harm the community versus trying to interact with that type of policing of the people inside the community. Um, those systems are rooted in an assembly style structure of governance. So the councils are informed by the collective assemblies, and really you need the collective assemblies is what actually set up uh, those councils come out of those because people have to be elected to those councils. Um, and from there, it goes over into the economic structure of cooperatives because a cooperative is a base um, of collective minded or collective interested people. And in some of that space, there's unions that are formed that work hand in hand with the cooperative. Um, and the unionizing is because, unfortunately, capitalism is widespread. It has to be addressed on that front by making sure that the labor power is leveraging its actual labor power in the relationship with those who want to extract that power. But also in other situations, the word cooperative union, like in Cuba, sometimes are synonymous because it's state-owned, and so they don't necessarily have to call it a. They use the word sindicato or syndicate, but that doesn't mean what we mean when we say it. And so in those structures, it's still about the electorate or an electoral type of assembly style of going about decision making around maybe we're all blacksmiths and we need to make collective decisions about how we're going to go about smithing and there's an electoral process that goes along with that. And so those are the structures that I aspire to see in our community. And we have to go around and think about these in a methodical way. How do we get to that point? What do we need to do? What's step one? What's step two? Right. But what for me is really important in my role is that if we can't feed ourselves, then you know how could we possibly leverage anything? Because we will be beholden to those who have control over our food. And if we don't have any ability to produce anything for ourselves, then we are going to forever be a cog, in my perspective, forever be a cog in the wheel. I could be wrong about that.
Thinking about, and to go back on this notion of cooperatives, right? The idea of cooperatives as a system of organizing society, or as a mode of organizing society that goes, and as someone, I've been to Cuba, I've been to, Colombo's in Brazil, Salvador Bahia, outside of Salvador Bahia. So I've actually seen, Maroon communities, contiguous communities that have been in these particular places, and particularly outside of Salvador Bahia in Brazil for generations, right? They literally, are, you're looking at the material representation of Maroon communities. And we see this, obviously, you mentioned Matanzas, you mentioned Cuba, we see them all over Cuba. Again, you mentioned, rightly so, most people don't pay attention to it enough, but I think, there's a growing level of interest and scholarship and community thinking around the role of Maroon communities in the United States, and particularly in the Great Dismal Swamp area of Virginia, running all the way down, to North Carolina. But then, I mean, again, Maroon communities, they were throughout the Americas, but I'm basically, saying there, so those structures. So when we think about this, and I wanted to go back to your rightly disaggregating or disrupting this notion of cooperatives, because I've heard, conversations in other podcasts and in other communities where they are looking at cooperatives in a very narrow form, and they rightly criticize them based upon that, which is that capitalist understanding of cooperatives. But when we think about economics, right? Economics is a basis of a management of resources through a system of exchange of goods and services, right? But the basis of this exchange does not have to be defined on a capitalist logic. And I think that that's, really understanding the uses of cooperatives and structures as a basis to move towards a more, what Cedric Robinson will call a Pan-African Commonwealth, or a more materialization of an institutionalization of Pan-African activity. I think it's important to understand and pull on what you're looking at, these more ancient and more indigenous understandings of organizing societies. And again, the terms that we're using are limiting, because again, you mentioned this, rightly so, is that we're living in a capitalist society. So some of these terms, when you hear them, some people have a visceral reaction to them. But we have to disaggregate them. We have to be clear about and to set the terms of engagement. And so I think that this becomes very important because, again, most people think about the economy based upon and defined through capitalist understandings of how exchange of services, how exchange of goods should be organized. But what you're talking about, and it's very important that I'm kind of raising this question or getting us to go down this rabbit hole, is because the work that you're doing is looking at the relationship of knowledge, material and non-material, that has been transferred through the cultural understandings of African people being first freely able to organize their societies pre-colonial, being forced to organize their societies for the benefit of the colonial. But then in this particular period of an anti-colonialist movement, that is still going on, because most people think that there's a post-colonial, but there is no post-colonial period, right? Um, you know, so, and even in the context of the reason why I'm raising this question, because even if you think about, the internal colonial condition of African people, the work that you're doing, that you're talking about, is looking at imperialism at its multiple expressions, not just this idea that it's a land over there, but the practices are actually implemented first here, and then expanded over there, but implemented over there, but expanded over here. So this relationship, it, through foodways and systems. Please, but go jump right in.
No, I mean, you hitting on something that I got a workshop that I'm doing with a comrade next week, and we're talking about time and the flow of time and how we view it, right? And trying to help our people see time in a way that isn't particularly linear, but also it's not themed. For instance, right? In the notion my comrade was saying, nonprofits come about in 19. And I was like, well, it's another interesting thing that happened in 1969 in Lowndes County, right? There's these things that are happening simultaneously and are directly and inextricably linked to each other. But we oftentimes are like always handed the information alien from each other. Like they don't want to talk about like, well, it's interesting that it's not this industrial complex starts at the same time as the Black Panther Party, and is oftentimes borrowing from the Black Panthers the work of the Black Panther, the free breakfast programs and all these things. So to go back to what you were talking about of like this conversation, right? I, I I'm gonna say something and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is just something that I say. I always tell people capitalism and imperialism are dialectical too. Um, they are coming in contact with resistance and changing to respond to that resistance, right? And they're not just static entities that are not going to shift its strategy to match to make sure that it continues to survive against your strategy, right? And so when we organize, we can't just I have to look at it going both ways, right? I can't just look in one direction or just act as if it is only happening to one singular community, right? Like when I was in Nigeria and I was in Igbo land and I was seeing how Igbo people were being treated, it dawned on me that whether my ancestors were enslaved or not, if I compared the treatment of people who I might share DNA with in this region, there and people the way my people are treated here, there's some similar. They're not directly the same thing, but due to the colonialization, there's some similar things due to the Biafran conflict and so on and so forth. So it's a back and forth, and I hope that like I said, I'm not answering your question. Please stop me, but yeah, I can't see history and time in this like this is linear, and this is why it gets into like almost like like you said, it's a material non-material type of approach to it because there's multiple things happening at once, and our work has to reflect that. Our work cannot just be solely about a particular condition. Like palm oil is from West Africa. It's in the majority of things that we eat and we come in contact with today. It's even making it the way into like fuel and other things at this point, right? Why is this West African crop or plant or material being now grown in the Western Hemisphere, right? Um, why did they take vanilla from Mexico to Madagascar to mass produce it? Why did they take chocolate from Veracruz to Cote d'Ivoire, right? Why, like these things, there wasn't just a one way, it wasn't a one way street. Things are going both ways, and both communities are dealing with and impacting with and it's actually using one community and in one way and implementing certain things in this community in a particular way and feeding off of how like many ways we see in Palestine. And I mean, one of the atrocities of of this whole situation is that if you trace back the history of it, of what's happening in Palestine, and even if you look at the Jewish community when they were in Germany and what was happening to them in that space, they'll point you back to the Americas and say, we got this from how y'all treated Native Americans. Right? It's like it's not this. Well, it just is. You know what I mean? You have to. It's not happening that way. I'm sorry, I got kind of excited. So hopefully that was like a very. It might not have been very clear, but yeah, it's not happening like that. You know, it just don't happen like that. And food doesn't work that way. Food and the global trade, and that's what taught me that it doesn't work that way. Things weren't just flowing one way. They were flowing multiple ways. Sugar comes from India, but it's primarily now produced in Colombia. Why? Right? Why is that happening? Why is this thing out of its original place? It's for a reason. You know what I mean? It's happened like that for a reason.
No, I mean, I think you raise an important process of, yeah, obviously we're talking, dialectical thinking, but I'm also thinking, particularly if we think about, philanthropy as the foundation of, nonprofit industrial complex. It was created to subvert the ability of radical and revolutionary work, particularly in Black communities and oppressed communities, but in particularly Black and Brown communities, as they are, finding ways to support in the face of direct violence. And this direct violence is also learning at the same time how to create, philanthropy and nonprofits to subvert, to steal those ideas, to commodify those ideas, to capture those ideas. So we see that happening, right? But on a global scale, we also see it through aid. We see it through, not in, international nonprofits that go into particular communities, saying that they're helping, but in actuality, they're doing more extracting. We see this as a gross manifestation in Haiti, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, other places. We see this all over the place. So this process, I mean, I always, think, mention that they, most people think that, or most people say that we as African and African descended people need to learn our history or don't know our history. Um, but also the radical side of the other side of that coin is that, white radicals don't know their own history. Right. So I think that's process, meaning that the pendulum swings both ways, is what I'm saying. And in African indigenous thought, though, keeping space for the pendulum swinging both ways, the holistic nature of understanding the relationship of the world, our relationship as human beings, as our sentient beings to each other, but also nature and the universe, is something that indigenous African thought understood and practiced through the cultivation of land, organizing the space, at the same time, understanding the substance that comes from the earth and appreciating that.
Yeah, I want to correct something I said. So I said Loudoun County, 1969. That was actually Oakland. The free breakfast program started in 1969. So I want to correct that. Loudoun County was 1965. So
You were thinking about the Panthers.
yeah, the Panthers. Yeah. So to respond to that, I mean, so what I heard, I'm gonna repeat what I think I heard you say, because it might be a thought, not a new thought, but a more clearer thought around something that I thought that now it gives me a way to articulate it. That the nonprofit industrial complex is something created in response to self-determination. Is what I think I heard you articulate, and which is diabolical when you think about it. In many ways, because that's, like you said, that's not just directed toward solely Black and brown people. When you see how that plays out in rural Appalachia, North Carolina, when it plays out into and West and like the whole Appalachia, the rural Appalachia in those communities, in the way that you know, in some ways it's a cycling of dollars and to pull more resources back into already existing foundations that are built off of, in many ways, the principal trading on the global market that is investing in the displacement of Africans in Colombia and the placement of indigenous people in Guatemala, and and the amount of companies um, that are sit at the top of that trading that these foundations are rooted in, uh, and that's something that, as somebody who's seen those communities and the violence that happens in those spaces, the paramilitaries, um, and the way that foundations and funding is associated with that, it makes it difficult. In some ways, it's embarrassing, and it makes it difficult to interact with those communities, because when George Floyd died, we said Black Lives Matter. But did we mean Black lives in Colombia? Did we mean Black lives in Oaxaca and in Costa Chica? Did we mean El Choco? Did we mean Bahia? Did we mean the Congo? Right? Do we think that those Black lives matter as Black people in the U.S.? I'm not saying we don't. It's just a question that make me ask myself when I'm willing to go and ask, whatever foundation for money, knowing that the money that they're giving me is directly tied to those people in the Congo and the lithium and the coltan and the things that they're mining. I think that kind of moving away. I don't know if I'm moving away from the question, but I think that's the relationship that I think about from an international Pan-African perspective around the insidious nature of that, and also the IMF and the World Bank essentially are also hand in hand with that as a global economic system that keeps the destabilization in these nations to where you can have something like, I mean, that was one of the most devastating things to me, to be in West Africa and see the lack of infrastructure when the natural resources that many of our nations utilize come from those spaces, right? If any place should have renewable energy, it should be West Africa, because most of the stuff that we utilize for our solar power is coming from that space. Should have clean energy on an astronomical level, right? But these infrastructures, these nonprofit, the USAID, these institutions, um, fortify themselves in ways that make these nations have to depend on them, and also aid and abet the extraction on that level. And I would love to find vehicles and means to educate more Black folks in the U.S. about what is happening. But we also got to mean that those lives matter when we say it.
Yeah, no, that, and it's important. Like I said, there's so much, because again, the work that you're doing, the connections that you're making, not only to the communities, the physical or the material communities, but the intellectual processes, the historical and ancestral ways that we think about the world, we think about space, land, how we think about our relationships to food, become essential, because again, this is a lens through which you can understand and map the world economic system, the world order, why people move, before, thousands of years ago, what people were doing, in the face of, the aggressive onslaught of chattel slavery, of apartheid, of this particular moment, right? We're faced with multiple crises at the moment. As we kind of put a pause in this particular conversation, could you talk a little bit about your organization, Symbiotic? Could you talk about its origins? What you intend to do with this vehicle, as you are also learning, teaching in this reciprocal process of giving taking, learning, and practicing, theory and practice. As you're engaged in that, what does Symbiotic as an organization fit into the trajectory of your work?
Yeah, I mean, our work is I mean, what we talking about is the work. And how do we, like I said, how do I get that to the black communities here in the US? And then there's some instances where we've been asked to like help communities on an international level. We're still looking at like how do we do that in a way that's reciprocal on all ends. And like what I mean by that is like we don't want to have any extractive form because we live in the belly of the beast. We don't want our work to be harmful on the international level at all. And so that takes a lot of thinking through and sensitivity and enjoying that. So so yeah, like we talked about the working with Salem, joining in with growers there. We've been actually like you talked about seed saving, and we started a project called the Odu Project, which is a land project that is doing this seed work and that cultural work in some ways, but also bringing that material and that ecological knowing to the work around like herbals and native trees and those things, as well as being able to bring seeds from the continent that we can, and then and Symbiotic is like the partnership to that project. As once those bases, those communities of growers are built, like how do we get them more engaged in the cooperative structures, the cooperative model, the understanding of how you interact. So we kind of do that natural material introduction to the environment and to the world, and then from there we kind of move over into like a more base building component and structure, and then and utilizing the historical material of or the political economy of a region of those folks that were brought to that space to kind of develop that base into more of a response. So as we get more growers, we have more producers and people doing it in a way that their relationship with that labor is different. It's not about this production for in a particular set, as those people some might be working and growing, some might be growing solely and working a little bit on the side, but we're not looking at labor as something that's extractive in that way, as well as engaging with larger cooperative development and coming in and helping communities. We have an issue where some of those cooperatives that we talked about oftentimes don't really last. And I think it's really important as we develop cooperatives that we do the historical and the material understanding of why this is important for our community and how do we address the needs of it and how can we think about this in an alternative way to not try to use all of the trappings of these already existing capitalistic structures like grocery stores and so on and so forth. We have to borrow some of it, but we don't have to use every component of it because the system is already set up for a particular type of relationship with labor and with material. And so we have to think about that and how we navigate that. And so we're bringing that know-how and that skill building, but also that relationship shifting and that intellectual concept note, and somewhat like that community aspect as well. So it's a lot of different folds to it, but and there's some other stuff coming. Hopefully, if I ever get to come back, I'll be able to tell you like, hey, this thing finally rolled out, and we're working on it. So I really I'm excited to continue that conversation as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've been connected, and and just we actually been able to just connect. We've been having conversations, but our
Yeah,
schedules really aligned to the point that both of us had like some crack in our times. Like, let's get
exactly.
on, let's get on and have this conversation
Exactly.
because I'm sure that it's such a robust conversation, and hopefully, it's generative for those who are going to be engaging. And I know it's generative for me,
Yeah.
but I cannot look at just from my particular lens. But I'm sure that there are things here. The reason why we do this work is to really connect with other folk who are thinking in similar ways, if not identical ways,
Hmm.
wherever they are in the spaces. And so, before I go, there's always folk who give land acknowledgments, and those things always kind of, get my skin to kind of perk up, because if you're going to acknowledge a land, then the next thing to do is also work to free that land, to give it back to the acknowledged community that you're giving that acknowledgement for. So as always, it's very, those types of things is, to kind of be owning a certain, land and give it an acknowledgement. It's another thing to work to free that land, to actually, return it to the stewards, not the owners. And I'm also thinking about, a lot of our colleagues and comrades and friends, use the concept of free the land. And I always back that up. People say it. It's like, free the land, not to recolonize the land.
Exactly.
So I think it's important for us, to understand the holistic nature of the work that we're doing on both sides. As we're working, understand the histories, to understand the conditions within which people were forced, or people were colonized in, and as we attempt to kind of move into this new. It's not new in some ways, but new in others. World historical space that we're in, with obviously a growing fascism, as it's kind of obviously articulating itself in Europe and other places, but in really refining itself here in the United States. We are indeed in a new space where we have to be clear, as Thomas Sankara had said, that imperialism is indeed on your plate. So, again, thank you for, taking the time. This is just one. There are some things I know that you're working on that are coming to fruition. And once, those things happens, of course, we'll talk about the actual, we've been talking, kind of like the ideas and, kind of theory. But you are a grower, you are a farmer, you are a chef, you are a person who is actually engaged in real substance. We're not just pontificating here, right?
No.
We're not just talking theory. There's things that you are, that is informing your work. But again, there's some things that I think, we definitely want our listeners to kind of see.
Can I say something?
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
It was actually, it's a comrade of mine in Puerto Rico, an organization called, I want to say it's Agricultura y Ecología de Boricua, and Jesus Vasquez. Yeah, I went to go visit him, and I spent time with him in Vieques and with some organizers, people who started his organization. And I learned there that we don't organize growers if we're not growers ourselves. We don't organize farmers if we're not farming ourselves. And as somebody who started it years ago, it was nothing for me to pick it back up. But I had to pair that with you do the work and you organize. Like, you don't just do the organizing work. And I know some organizers out there listening to this gonna be like, organizing is work. It is. But as many of the ones that preceded us, they organized while working. They would go in to the job, get a job, and then start the union as somebody internal to the job. So that's how in farming is the same way. Like, people want to see your work. So I just wanted to leave that. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. I mean, it goes back to, when we talk about labor and work, right?
Exactly.
That comes important. Again, thank you for taking the time to, to just kind of, think through some things, talk about your work, talk about, the deep implications of what you're bringing to the table in Black freedom movements. Again, thank you. He's